There's a kind of pain most men don't talk about, not because it's too sharp, but because it's too slow. It doesn't scream, it lingers. A slow erosion of who you are as a man, one ignored message at a time, one postponed plan, one evening where you waited for nothing. It's not rejection that wounds you, it's the tolerance. The quiet toleration of your presence like background noise. You weren't hated, you were postponed, and over time that delay becomes your default position. Invisible, optional. What makes this worse is that you weren't chasing attention. You weren't desperate for affection. You just wanted to be seen as a presence, not a resource, to be recognized not for what you could do, but for who you are when you say nothing. But modern noise confuses presence with usefulness. And if you're not useful, you're disposable. That's the quiet truth many men live with and never speak of. The craving isn't for applause. It's for presence to be enough. Zeno of Citium didn't begin as a philosopher. He began as a man who lost everything. A shipwreck stripped him of what he owned but gave him what he lacked: clarity. That moment for many of us doesn't come with a crash. It comes with silence. A night where she didn't respond. A look that told you everything had shifted. The realization that you are no longer her priority is your shipwreck. And that ground, right there, is your chance. Your philosophical ground zero. You either build from that silence, or you disappear into it. Epictetus said, "If you want to be free, then act free." But freedom isn't rebellion, it's restraint. It's knowing when your dignity is bleeding out through invisible wounds, and stopping the loss. Freedom begins when you stop giving attention to what makes you feel smaller. It begins not in reaction, but in retreat. Not in aggression, but in stillness. To stop being her option, you don't need to become cold. You need to remember your weight. This isn't about getting her to chase you. It's not about winning her back or proving your value. If that's your goal, you've already lost something deeper. This video is about reclaiming the inner ground you gave away every time you waited, every time you stayed, every time you convinced yourself that maybe tomorrow she'd see you differently. It's not about punishment, it's about presence, yours. So no, this won't be a guide to making her jealous. This is a mirror and a map. A mirror for the parts of you that went silent when she spoke over your needs. A map to the man you used to be before you made your peace with being second. If you're ready to hear that truth, not the one that comforts, but the one that sets you still, keep listening. Because silence isn't weakness. Sometimes it's the only language dignity speaks. It didn't happen the night she didn't respond. It happened the moment you explained it away. That shift from presence to permission, from being a man with a center to someone orbiting her silence. The truth is, most men don't lose respect in a loud fight. They lose it quietly, in the spaces where they surrender their standards, again and again, without realizing. Not because they're weak, but because they hoped. And hope, when misplaced, becomes self-erasure. You thought your patience would win her clarity, but all it did was train her that your boundaries were flexible, that you'd wait, that you'd always return, even when your presence was met with indifference. She didn't need to raise her voice, because your silence did the work for her. You stopped demanding space not because you didn't need it, but because you feared the cost of losing access to someone who had already emotionally stepped away. Behavioral psychology calls it intermittent reinforcement, but you've lived it. The way she gives you just enough to keep you trying, the way she vanishes, then reappears with softness, only to pull away again. It rewires you. You start to crave the very instability that's bleeding your self-respect. Not because you love chaos, but because the chaos holds a memory of connection, and you're chasing it like a ghost. There's a moment every man faces where silence isn't strength. It's fear. A fear of confrontation, of abandonment, of accepting that her behavior is the answer you've been trying not to hear. And so you swallow words. You delay decisions. You choose peace over presence. And each time, she sees it. Not consciously, maybe, but something in her recalibrates. Respect is eroded in micro-decisions, in the quiet okay when you should have walked, in the soft smile when you should have stood still. Zeno once said that strength isn't found in reaction, but also not in tolerance. Stoicism is not the art of being unbothered. It's the art of knowing when to walk away without explanation. When you let her behavior slide, you weren't being noble. You were being afraid of the echo that follows real boundaries. But that echo, that silence, is where your dignity returns. You just have to stop filling it with justifications. Every time you show up hoping she'll see your worth, you're spending something sacred. Not time, not energy, something deeper. your masculine attention, and most men don't realize how valuable it is until it's been spent on someone who never intended to earn it. When you offer your presence without being valued, you're not being generous. You're being diminished. You're trading dignity for delay. Attention, for a man, isn't a transaction. It's identity. What you give attention to becomes your mirror. And if you keep handing that mirror to someone who only reflects indifference, you start to believe that's all you are. Mirror neurons don't just imitate emotion, they rewrite it. They take in how she treats you and silently reshape how you treat yourself. You start thinking you're optional, because that's how she responds to you. Not with cruelty, but with the kind of passivity that feels worse than hate, indifference. Epictetus warned, you become what you give attention to. That's not just philosophy, that's reality. You don't just lose time with her, you lose parts of yourself that you once protected. The parts that knew what it meant to be still, to be rooted, to be whole without needing someone to reflect it back to you. But when you keep showing up in spaces where you're not seen, you slowly erase your own outline. And it's not always dramatic. Most of the time, it's habitual. She sends a vague message. You respond with depth. She cancels a plan. You rearrange your schedule. She disappears for days. You wait without questions. That repetition doesn't teach her to love you. It teaches her to expect you. Not because she's cruel, but because she's human. And humans normalize what is repeated. You made your presence predictable. And in her eyes, that meant replaceable. You think staying available will prove your value. But availability without discernment isn't love. It's self-disrespect. It tells her and yourself that you'll keep showing up no matter how you're received. But masculine attention, when it's grounded, is not eager. It's sacred. It's rare. It's slow-moving and deeply intentional. And when you give it freely to someone who doesn't treasure it, you don't just lose her respect, you lose your own. After being emotionally sidelined, many men do the one thing that guarantees more erosion. They try harder, not from strength, but from panic. Not because they believe they're worthy, but because they're desperate to prove it. You became more available. You became more understanding. You made yourself easier to love, thinking love would come if you just adjusted enough. But love that requires you to bend until you break was never love. It was performance. Trying harder wasn't a correction. It was a reaction. A quiet reaction to abandonment. You weren't fixing anything, you were bargaining. You were offering pieces of yourself in the hope that she'd offer clarity. But clarity doesn't come through sacrifice. It comes through presence. And Stoicism teaches one thing above all. Do not remain where your value must be negotiated. There's a story too common to ignore. A man rearranges his entire life around a woman who never made space for him. He moves cities. He changes plans. He softens his voice. He steps back when she pulls away. He waits, always waiting, until one day she's gone. And when she goes, she doesn't even look back, because in her eyes, he was always just there, always ready, always reachable. She never had to wonder if he'd stay, and so she never had to value the fact that he did. That man wakes up, not in rage, but in emptiness, not because she left, but because in the process of trying to stay, he lost himself. He looks in the mirror and doesn't recognize the man staring back, not because he's become someone else, but because he's become less than he was. Not in spirit, but in presence. He gave too much, and in return received nothing that resembled what he gave. The Stoic doesn't retreat out of spite. He retreats with clarity, because he knows something vital. What you tolerate trains the world how to treat you. Trying harder for someone who's already emotionally absent is like speaking louder to someone who's already decided not to listen. It doesn't restore love. It erases self. To stop this cycle, you don't need a louder voice. You need a quieter standard, one that whispers, "This is who I am, and if you can't meet me here, I won't beg. I'll walk." Not with anger, not with blame, but with the quiet conviction that your presence is not something to be proven. It's something to be honored. And if it isn't, then your absence will say what your words never could. Many men carry a quiet belief that if she just understood them, everything would change. That if she knew the depth of their loyalty, the weight of their silence, the reasons behind their stillness, she would soften. She would return. She would finally see. But understanding is not the same as valuing. A person can understand you perfectly and still never respect you, still never choose you, still never stay. This is the most dangerous illusion. That emotional exposure creates intimacy, that telling your story guarantees connection. But sometimes, Telling her everything just shows her how much you'll give without needing anything back. Vulnerability, in the wrong hands, doesn't build bridges. It drains the soul, and you end up more unseen than when you kept it all inside. She might know exactly who you are. She might understand your struggles, your principles, your heart, and still, she may never value it. Because value isn't about knowledge. It's about care. It's about presence. And when you speak your truth to someone who's already decided not to listen, you're not being brave. You're being unheard in a louder way. Seneca once wrote that even the wise man only speaks when his words strengthen his inner structure. He doesn't share to be healed. He shares to clarify, to reinforce. And that's the line many men cross without realizing. They speak not to stand firmer, but to be saved, to be reassured, to be held. But when you speak from a place of need to someone who can't meet you, your voice becomes an echo, bouncing back empty. If she doesn't see you in your silence, your words won't wake her. If your presence didn't teach her your value, your pain won't either. What you say matters, but only to those willing to listen, and not just hear, but feel. But if her presence remains distant, if her gaze never lands fully on who you are without you having to explain it, then speaking more only deepens the loneliness. It becomes a plea, not a presence. To be understood is a gift, but to be valued, that's the foundation. And if you have to keep explaining yourself over and over just to be seen, you're not in a connection, you're in a performance. One that slowly trains you to believe that your soul must be spoken into worth, but it doesn't. You are already worthy in silence. The right presence feels it. The wrong one never will. A boundary isn't a threat. It's not a loud announcement or a sharp exit. It's a quiet declaration of self-respect. Masculine boundaries don't beg for change. They reveal change. Not in her, but in you. The decision to stop explaining, to stop proving, to stop adjusting who you are just to be tolerated, is the beginning of reclaiming who you were before her indifference shaped you. Most men confuse boundaries with ultimatums. They think they need to issue warnings, create consequences, or perform strength. But real strength doesn't need performance. It doesn't shout. It doesn't argue. It doesn't chase understanding. It simply withdraws, not in anger, in clarity. It states the truth once and lets silence do the rest. Zeno walked the streets in thought, not because he lacked direction, but because every step was a decision to stay centered. He didn't move to escape. He moved to return. When you set a boundary without noise, without punishment, without emotional fallout, you are doing the same. You're remembering who you were before you gave so much away just to be chosen. There's a model that isn't flashy, but changes everything. First, state reality once, without drama. This isn't working. I don't feel respected here. I'm done chasing something that won't meet me. Say it clearly. Say it calmly. Say it only once. Second, withdraw energy without debate. You don't need to defend your worth. You don't need to convince her of your pain. She already knows. She just doesn't care the way you do. So don't try to reframe it. Just stop feeding it. Third, refocus your attention on your own structure. Your mind, your time, your physical space, your discipline. The ground you abandoned while waiting for her to see you is the very ground where your masculinity rebuilds. This isn't about punishing her. It's about remembering yourself, about drawing a line not around her, but within you, a line that says, I don't explain my worth anymore. I don't argue to be seen. I don't remain where I'm optional. And most importantly, I don't confuse stillness with weakness. My boundary is not noise. It's absence. Not absence to provoke, but absence to protect, to restore, to return to the man I was before I mistook being available for being valuable. There is no grand moment, no loud goodbye, no final confrontation that restores your dignity. Most of the time, it's a quiet shift, barely noticeable from the outside. No texts, no final call, just a decision made deep inside. I'm done explaining my worth. That's where it begins. Not with a scream, but with stillness. Not in reaction, but in resolve. You don't owe anyone a performance, especially not someone who saw your consistency and treated it as convenience. There's no need to slam doors when silence will do more. No need to write speeches when distance already speaks. The man who walks away without rage is the man she'll feel longer than the one who begged to be seen, because rage fades, but presence withheld, that lingers. There's a man who stopped texting. No long message. No emotional explanation. Just stopped. Because every word felt like a drop in an empty well, and what happened next wasn't heartbreak. It was clarity. For the first time, in a long time, he heard his own silence, and it didn't feel lonely. It felt clean, like something sacred had returned. Detachment isn't about becoming cold. It's about becoming accurate. When you detach, your mind stops chasing fantasy. Your nervous system resets. The dopamine loops that kept you checking your phone, rereading old messages, imagining new beginnings, fade. And in that absence, something returns. The memory of who you were before all of this. The man who didn't need to be chosen to feel whole. The man who didn't seek permission to be enough. Rebuilding doesn't begin with revenge. It begins with realignment, quiet mornings, focused movement, the sound of your own breath without waiting for someone to text you back. It's not glorious, it's not cinematic, but it's real, and real is what heals. What you walk away from defines you more than what you win. Anyone can chase validation. Few can walk away from it. Few can sit with the discomfort of absence long enough for it to become peace. Few can say, this silence isn't punishment, it's protection, and I'm not waiting to be seen anymore. I'm remembering that I always was. That's how self-respect is reclaimed, not through noise, through a decision, a quiet, final one. I just want to understand what happened. That sentence has kept more men stuck than silence ever did, because clarity feels noble. It feels like closure, like the final thread you need to cut before you can move on. But often, that desire for clarity isn't about healing. It's about control. It's the last attempt to make sense of why someone who once looked at you with warmth now treats you like a stranger. It's a quiet plea. Make this make sense so I can feel whole again. But that plea isn't heard. Because the truth is, she already told you what happened. Not in words, in behavior, in the way she stopped trying, in how you always had to initiate, in how her energy changed. But she never gave you the language to grieve it. And so you began chasing a ghost. Not the woman she is, but the idea of who she was, before she emotionally checked out. Chasing that kind of clarity doesn't ground you. It erases you. It keeps you in a loop where your dignity depends on an answer she has no intention of giving. Maybe because she can't. Maybe because she doesn't care to. Either way, your waiting becomes self-abandonment. You're not looking for truth anymore. You're looking for justification. And even if she gave it, it wouldn't heal the ache you carry. Because the ache was never about logic. It was about loss. The Stoic doesn't demand clarity from others. He accepts what has been shown, not what's left unsaid. Because there's a point when your pursuit of closure becomes your refusal to accept what's already been revealed. You saw the silence. You felt the pullback. You knew when the tone shifted. You didn't need her to say it. You just needed permission to believe what you already knew. Zeno didn't sit at the wreckage wondering why the ship sank. He walked. He started again. Not because he didn't feel pain, but because he knew clarity wouldn't be found in the wreckage, only in movement, only in rebuilding. Closure doesn't come from her words. It comes from your choice to end the conversation, even if the sentence feels unfinished. To choose silence, not as surrender, but as sovereignty. You don't need another explanation. You need distance. You don't need her truth. You need your own. The one that says, I saw what I needed to see. I don't need more words. I need to walk. Not because you stopped caring, but because you finally started remembering who you are without her answers. That is closure. Quiet, complete, and yours. This was never about becoming colder. It was never about punishing her. It was about becoming more whole. A man doesn't reclaim himself by reacting louder. He reclaims himself by stepping back into his center, the place he abandoned when he started waiting to be chosen. Zeno of Citium didn't rebuild his life by searching the ocean for what he lost. He didn't chase the wreckage. He stood in the silence of absence and built again, not with bitterness, but with presence. He didn't need the past to make sense. He needed himself to be enough, and that became his foundation. Marcus Aurelius reminded us, the best revenge is not to be like your enemy, but maybe more than that. The best clarity is to live in such a way that their absence becomes irrelevant, not ignored, not erased, just no longer needed. So picture this, a man walking away, no anger, no heartbreak, no unfinished speeches, just presence, just clarity, just peace. His silence behind him isn't a punishment. It's not a power move. It's freedom, finally echoing.